Gracious Father, we do want to just stop at the outset of this class and thank you for your word. Thank you for your indwelling spirit who takes your word, gives us understanding, applies it to our life. And Father, that's what we ask for. Please help us understand your word. Give Deepak clarity of speech and give him help him explain the book of Lamentations to us, Father. And we just anticipate the answer to this prayer. We thank you in your son's name. Amen.
Amen. All right. So like you said, we will be in Lamentations today. So last time we met.
So how do I get it?
I need to share my screen.
I see.
So last time we met, a little over a couple of months ago, we finished Song of Solomon. So we're just picking up where we left out, and today will be Lamentations. So before I go into the book, I just wanted to kind of go back and do a quick recap of where we're at in the Bible. So like we've been doing, we're not reading the Bible in our kind of our English Bible order. We're following the Hebrew Bible order, or as our textbook says, Jesus's Bible. And so the way Jesus' Bible split is the law, prophets, and writings. And so we have the law, which is the first 5 books, just as we have in our English Bibles. And then it continues through the narrative books from Joshua to 2 Kings. And then the narrative stops. And then we get the latter prophets, which is Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and the book of the 12, which is commentary on the story that's in the former prophets. And then the writings, which started with Psalms and ends with Lamentations, which we'll cover today. They continue the commentary. And then after Lamentations, the narrative picks up again. So basically the Old Testament is narrative, commentary, narrative. And today's the last book of the commentary. So it kind of serves as the bridge back into the narrative. So there are a few reasons why Lamentations is where it is. One is we see the commentary starts with Jeremiah. And we'll see as we get in there that Lamentations is traditionally thought of as being authored by Jeremiah. So we have Jeremiah kind of opening the commentary, and then he's also ending the commentary. And also, as we look into the content of Lamentations, it'll talk about the exile, and which is kind of where the narrative left off. So the narrative is from the time, from the entry to the promised land to the Babylonian exile. So the story stopped in 2 Kings with the people of Judah going into exile, and the Lamentations is commentary on that. So it's kind of reorient and take us back to the narrative, so that when Daniel comes, we kind of know where we left off the narrative. And so that's why Lamentations is here in the Hebrew Bible. And yes, I think with that, we can go to our chapter in our textbook. All right, so Lamentations. The name Lamentations is because the book is a collection of laments. In the Hebrew Bible, the name is called, I don't know how to say Ika maybe, but it is, the word means how, which is from the first word of the book. So the book starts saying how lonely sits the city. So they took that first word, how, and that's the name of the book, which, as we've been seeing so far, a lot of the Old Testament books are named after the first word, the first Hebrew word. So that's the name. And so like I said, the author, the book is technically anonymous, meaning within the 5 chapters of the book, the author never identifies himself. But ancient Jewish tradition says that Jeremiah was the author. And so there's a couple of arguments for that. So we know from 2 Chronicles 35:25 that he did utter laments. When it gets there before me, you can read it.
Well, 35:25.
Mhm.
You're gonna be. Okay. Second Chronicles 35:25. Jeremiah also uttered a lament for Josiah, and all the singing men and singing women have spoken of Josiah in their laments to this day. They made these a rule in Israel. Behold, they are written in the laments.
All right. So we can see that Jeremiah, he uttered a lament, and also it says how it was written down. So it would make sense that he made more than just that one lament and how that would be written down. And also we see in the book of Jeremiah that there's lots of places where he's calling for people to lament. So maybe we can just touch on like the first two in there. 4:8.
I've got 6:26.
Okay, all right. So 4:8 is, for this put on sackcloth, lament and wail, for the fierce anger of the Lord has not turned back from us.
And 6:26 says, O daughter of my people, put on sackcloth and roll in ashes, make mourning for his own, for as for an only son, most bitter lamentation, for suddenly the destroyer will come upon us.
Mhm. And yes, we see there's a few more references throughout the book of Jeremiah, where he's calling the people into mourning and lamenting. So it would make sense that when the exile actually happens, that he himself would be the author of laments, which is written for us. So those are kind of a couple of reasons why Jeremiah could be the author of Lamentations. So whether the author is Jeremiah or not, what we know just from the text is that the author was someone who experienced and mourned the exile of Judah. And he was convinced that Judah's destruction was divine judgment for the people's sins. And yet he retained a deep confidence in Yahweh's faithfulness. So this is kind of getting into the content of the book, but yeah, so just looking at that, we know that this applies for Jeremiah too, just from what we know from the narrative and from the book of Jeremiah, that he was there when the exile happened. So like we looked at before, in the Hebrew Bible, Lamentations is the last of the former writings, and it serves as a bridge back into the narrative history that stopped at the end of 2 Kings. But in the Greek and the English Bibles, the book is connected with Jeremiah, so it comes right after his prophetic book. So yes, in both the Hebrew and the English ones, they were linking Lamentations with Jeremiah. The Hebrew Bible does it different, where it kind of begins and ends the commentary with Jeremiah, where in the English Bibles, it's they're just right after each other. All right, so moving on to the next section, the scope. This book was written shortly after Judah's downfall in 586 BC, when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem and its temple, and it shows the raw emotions that are still very fresh and painful from a very recent tragedy. And the initial recipients would have been other Jews who would also experience a defeat and exile. But the initial recipients would have been those who, they didn't die during the Babylon invasion, and also those who hadn't been taken into captivity. The initial recipients would have been the ones who were left behind in Judah. And the book contains both individual and communal laments from three voices. So it's written by one author, but then the author is also kind of taking on the voices of the community too. So like it says here, the author, he's the author of all five laments. And in chapter 3, it gets very personal. So there's that's the most personal of the five laments. And then the first two chapters, he's talking about the perspective of the city of Jerusalem, which is personified in the first two laments. And the last couple of laments is he's talking as a community, as the people of God. And I don't know if I mentioned already, but Lamentations has 5 chapters, which are 5 different laments. And we'll look at the structure of that in a little bit. All right, so that is scope and name and author. Moving on, we have the big picture. Yeah, so like I just said, there are 5 chapters, which are 5 laments. So this is kind of a heading for each of the lament. So the first one is Jerusalem's sorrow, and then Scott's punishment, Jeremiah's pain, which, like I said, the third lament is kind of the one that's personal. And then last couple is Jerusalem's siege and Jeremiah's plea. All right, so we have 3 key themes for the book of Lamentations. The author of Lamentations acknowledged Israel's sin and God's uprightness in judging. And then the author of Lamentations was brutally honest with God about emotional and spiritual pain. Then finally, the author of Lamentations stressed God's faithfulness as the basis for hope in suffering. Right, so that's 3 themes from our very small book, and our chapter in the textbook was also really small. All right, so the stage for the book is that the Babylonians had sacked Jerusalem, and they destroyed the temple of Yahweh. They slaughtered or ravaged hundreds of men, women, and children, and they took many Jewish captives into exile. So the captives here, like you can think of like Daniel and Ezekiel, they were some of the ones who were taken as captives. And also, if you remember the story, Jeremiah was not taken as captive. He was one of the people who was left behind in Judah. And so what happened, when the city is gone and the temple is gone is kind of what we've been looking through the Old Testament so far in terms of God's promises, like what God promised to Abraham, that he would have a lot of descendants, and the descendants would have the land. Now you see thousands and thousands of his descendants are slaughtered, and the land is gone. They've been kicked out of the land, except for very few who were still left behind. And then God's promise to Moses, the Mosaic Covenant, is that God will live amongst his people if they keep the law, where God was among his people in the tabernacle, and then eventually that became the temple. And now the Babylonians destroyed the temple to the ground. So the God's physical presence in the land is no more. And then the other covenant is the Davidic Covenant. God's promise to David that one of his descendants will be on the throne of Judah forever. And obviously, when the Babylonians they sack Jerusalem and take people as captive, they also, the king is no more. They don't have a king. So it looks like all of the promises that God made and what gave people identity, all of that is gone. So naturally, it makes sense why the author would be lamenting. And so, according to the author of Lamentations, this disaster was expected because God has been warning Israel for hundreds of years that its sin would incur punishment. And we see this most explicitly spelled out in the Mosaic Covenant. If God's people did not follow God's law, that is, heeding the covenant, he would curse them. And it lays out different curses, and it climaxes in him expelling them from the land of promise. So there are those 2 references which are pretty big. So I think we can just hit a few of those verses in there. So Leviticus 26, maybe just do, I wrote down 31 to 33.
Okay. Leviticus 26, 31 to 33. And I will lay your cities waste and will make your sanctuaries desolate. And I will not smell your pleasing aromas. And I myself will devastate the land so that your enemies who settle in it shall be appalled at it. And I will scatter you among the nations and I will unsheath the sword after you, and your land shall be a desolation, and your cities shall be a waste.
Mhm. So the big section there, 14 to 39, it kind of starts with, what God would do if they disobey the commandments, and it kind of, slowly progresses, and like it says, this climaxes in them getting kicked out of the land. And same thing with Deuteronomy. You don't have to read the whole chapter, but I just done 63 to 65.
Okay. 63 to 65.
Mhm.
Okay. Deuteronomy 28, 63 to 65. And as the Lord took delight in doing you good and multiplying you, so the Lord will take delight in bringing ruin upon you and destroying you. And you shall be plucked off the land that you are entering to take possession of it. And the Lord will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other. And there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known. And among these nations you shall find no respite, and there shall be no resting place for the sole of your foot. But the Lord will give you there a trembling heart and failing eyes and a languishing soul.
And again, Deuteronomy 28, it actually starts out laying the blessings for obedience, and then it goes into the curses. And it's interesting how the curses take up most of the chapter.
Yeah.
And, you can tell that God knew that the curses was what's going to happen, and that's what they needed. And yeah, so here it kind of lays out that it was God who caused all this to happen, and the author knew that. So when the tragedy occurs, he's not lamenting, saying like, "Oh no, why did this happen?" He knows exactly why it happened, but that doesn't mean that they're being punished, and he's just going to take the punishment in silence. It still is painful, and it's still okay for them to express their pain and lament. And actually going on in that, it wasn't just the Mosaic Covenant that said that this punishment was coming. The prophets, they were sent by God to continue to remind people of this. They were calling people back to the covenant, saying that if you don't obey, this is God is going to punish you. And even when the northern kingdom was destroyed, so in our narrative, after the kingdom got split into two, we got Israel, who a few generations before Judah was in exile, they went into exile with Assyria. And even when that happened, Judah did not take God's covenant seriously. And that's what we see in Jeremiah chapter 3.
Want me to read that?
Yes.
Jeremiah 3, 6 through 11. The Lord said to me in the days of King Josiah, have you seen what she did, that faithless one, Israel? How she went up on every high hill and under every green tree, and there played the whore? And I thought, after she has done all this, she will return to me. But she did not return, and her treacherous sister Judah saw it. She saw that for all the adulteries of the faithless one, Israel, I had sent her away with a decree of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she too went and played the whore, because she took her whoredom lightly. She polluted the land, committing adultery with stone and tree. Yet for all this, her treacherous sister Judah did not return to me with her whole heart, but in pretense, declares the Lord. And the Lord said to me, faithless Israel has shown herself more righteous than treacherous Judah.
Yeah, so It's basically God's perspective of what's going on. And it says in the days of Josiah, so it was only like a couple of generations before Josiah's grandfather. Hezekiah was on the throne when Assyria was kind of the common enemy for Israel and Judah. And they saw how Israel fell, and they were destroyed and they were taken captive. And it says that, it did not change their behavior. And it actually says that Israel was found more righteous than Judah, because even after seeing the example of Israel, it did not change their behavior, and they still continued on the same path. And the promised punishments from the covenant were eventually executed by God. So that's how we know that the author of Lamentations, he knew that this is God who's sending the punishment, and we'll see that in the book itself. So so in Lamentations itself, it says how the Lord has executed what he said he would do. We can read both of those references.
Okay. Lamentations 2:17 and then 3:37, 38. 2:17. The Lord has done what he purposed. He has carried out his word, which he commanded long ago. He has thrown down without pity. He has made the enemy rejoice over you and exalted the might of your foes. Then in chapter 2, 3 rather, 36 and 37.
37, 38.
37, 38. Who has spoken and it came to pass, unless the Lord has commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come?
All right, so the one in chapter 2, it's referring back to the covenant and the punishment and how God is doing what he's already said he would do long ago. And then in chapter 3, we get more of a generic understanding of what's going on, that what happens without God's knowledge. Everything that happens is because God commanded, but good and bad, which was kind of an echo of what we hear from Job, where Job says, okay, is it okay to accept good from God, but not evil? And Job also admits that, everything good and bad comes from God. And our author of Lamentations would agree with him. So
I'll see a connection between Judah and the United States, kind of a similarity.
Oh,
yeah,
We've watched many countries before us, and we haven't learned either.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we watch Europe, we watch Canada, and it doesn't seem to change anything. We're kind of following the same trajectory.
That's right. It's like, oh boy, let's do it too. Only more.
Yeah. I guess even going back to like ancient times, like, what we're doing is kind of right along what happened in ancient Rome.
Yeah.
All right. So we know that God was the one who executed the punishment. And even though Babylon was the immediate cause of the devastation of Judah, the author of Lamentation says over and over again that it was the sovereign God of Israel who was the ultimate cause.
Yes.
And maybe you can just get like the ones from chapter 1 and 2.
Okay, sure. Lamentations 1, verse 12 and 17. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. Zion stretches out her hands, but there is none to comfort her. The Lord has commanded against Jacob that his neighbors should be his foes. Jerusalem has become a filthy thing among them. In chapter 2:21. Chapter 2, verse 21. In the dust of the streets lie the young and the old. My young women and my young men have fallen by the sword. You have killed them in the day of your anger, slaughtering without pity.
Mhm. And the you there is he's talking to God.
Yes.
And so he's acknowledging that, it's not the Babylonians who were the cause of it, even though they were the human actors. It's God, the God of Israel, who's the ultimate cause of all of this. And we actually see this spelled out in other places in the Bible, especially the prophets, where it says God was going to use Babylon as this tool to teach his people a lesson. Right. And the next, the author accepted that the suffering the nation was experiencing was flowing from the righteous wrath of God. So, first he kind of says that it's God who is the cause, and then he's saying it's because God is righteous this is happening. So you want to do 118?
Sure. Chapter 1, verse 18. The Lord is in the right, for I have rebelled against his word. But hear, all you peoples, and see my suffering. My young women and my young men have gone into captivity. Now, this is the voice of Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem, right?
Yeah. And then let me read the one from chapter 4:11. The Lord gave full vent to his wrath. He poured out his hot anger, and he kindled a fire in Zion that consumed its foundations. So it's talking more about the wrath of God and how it's the righteous wrath of God. And so that is how we see how the author of Lamentations, he's acknowledging Israel's sin and God's uprightness in judging it. So yes, I was struck by this, how, personally, when we think of lamenting after something tragic happens, the first question we ask is why? And the author is very clear on why this happened. And he says, it's because of their sin and it's because of God punishing them, and how, what God did is right. But that doesn't mean that we're just going to take it and we're going to be silent. It's still okay to lament what happened. And that's why we get this book. We get this book of laments that, he's still acknowledging what's happened, but, they're still going to be honest about what they're actually feeling, which is our second theme. The author of Lamentations was brutally honest with God about emotional and spiritual pain. So the author of Lamentations honestly and vigorously vented his feelings to and about God. And we know that he's doing this vigorously just from the structure of the book. So each of the 5 laments is built around the number 22, reflecting the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And the structure, it focuses on the completeness of his grief, as he's drawing on every letter that he could, that could be used to express the depth of his pain. So so this is not something that we're typically familiar with in our kind of English literature, but so this is kind of, I guess this is fairly common in the Bible and in Bible times, that they use an alphabet acrostic as a structure. So what's going on in the 5 laments here is that the first lament 1 and 2, it has 3 line stanzas, and there are 22 of them, and each begins with a consecutive Hebrew letter. So that's why in our English Bibles too, we have 22 verses in chapters 1 and 2 that are all 3 stanzas, are 3 line stanzas. And then in chapter 3, there are 3 lines in each stanza, but all 3 of them begins with the same letter in the Hebrew. So this is the most developed form of the acrostic, and it's the only lament that's dominated by the author's voice. So when we look back in here, we talked about how chapter 3 was the one that was most personal of the laments, which also makes sense why it's the most developed of this alphabet acrostic, where it's not just the first line, but all 3 lines in the stanza. It begins with the consecutive Hebrew letter, and it also has 22 3-line stanzas. So in the English here, they actually split up every single line in the stanzas. So instead of 22 verses, we get 66 verses in chapter 3.
So that that all three lines begin with the consecutive letter that emphasizes and therefore intensifies what he's saying, therefore indicating the intense grief.
And yeah, chapter Lament 4 has 22 two-line stanzas. So it's similar to 1 and 2, except instead of 3 lines, it's 2 lines. And it also has the consecutive letter. And finally, the last lament, it still has 22 stanzas, but this time there's no alphabet acrostic for that. But yeah, the idea of having these kind of using every single letter in the alphabet is to show how, his grief is so complete that it's from A to Z, and everything that he can think of, it kind of is used to express the pain. And it shows us, not just in the actual words, but also in the structure, also how, how deep and wide is the pain that they're going through.
So that number C there, Lament 4 has 22 two-line stanzas with a consecutive. Each two-line stanza begins with the same letter, each line of the 2-line, or just the first word of the
It's the first word
of the 2-line. Okay,
yeah.
Gotcha.
Wow, I had no idea about this. That's really interesting.
We in modern writing, we have lots of different ways to show emphases. Bold font. We have headings. We have lots of different ways like that to show emphasis and structure and all of that. They didn't, so they used stuff like this. That's why it's so different to us, but it's impressive.
And that's kind of how they structured most of their stuff, that the one in the middle is the most important one. So if this has 5 chapters, the 3rd chapter would be the important one, because that's in the middle, that's kind of climax. Kind of like what we've been seeing in our sermon series, how in Leviticus chapter 16 is not just in the middle of Leviticus, but it's also in the middle of the whole Pentateuch. So it's kind of the highest point of the whole Pentateuch, as Wes has been saying. And that kind of feels very different to our Western thinking, where you'd probably leave the most important stuff at either the beginning or the end, but they actually put it in there right in the middle.
Yeah, like a chiasm.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. And the author expresses honestly how it felt that God had turned against him. You want to read that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Lamentations 3, 2-9. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has made me dwell in darkness like the dead of long ago. He has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has made my chains heavy. Though I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with blocks of stones. He has made my paths crooked.
So he's talking about how God has turned against him. And he also mentions how God is deaf to his prayers, which we just read in verse 8 there. Though I call and cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. Then later on in the same chapter in 44, you have wrapped yourself with a cloud so that no prayer can pass through. And then he also says, continuing on in what we just read, God also attacked him like a wild beast or enemy soldier.
Chapter 3, 10 through 13.
Mhm.
He is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. He turned aside my steps and tore me to pieces. He has made me desolate. He bent his bow and set me as a target for his arrow. He drove into my kidneys the arrows of his quiver. Ouch.
And if you read the next verse, it's talking about how God humiliated him.
I have become the laughing stock of all peoples, the object of their taunts all day long.
And finally, all of that left him in despair, which is 17 to 20.
My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, my endurance has perished. So is my hope from the Lord. Remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me.
Yes, so it's interesting also how all of this sounds very similar to some of the other laments we've seen in the Psalms, and especially to Job. And what's interesting is that the authors already expressed that this is God doing, and this is God's righteous punishment against the sins of his people. Whereas in Job kept mentioning how he's innocent and he doesn't understand why this is going on. But in terms of the actual pain that they're expressing, it's very similar. Even though one claims that he knows the cause and he has no complaints against it, but he still feels the same pain as as someone who doesn't understand what's going on. All right, so now we get into kind of some of the paradoxes that he's feeling. So he felt as though God did not hear his prayers, which we just read, but he expresses confidence that God has heard him.
55 to 57. I called on your name, O Lord, from the depths of the pit. You heard my plea. Do not close your ear to my cry for help. You came near when I called on you. You said, do not fear.
And then another paradox is he states that there's no one to bring him comfort. And I guess we can read. Well, we have time to read all of them, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah. It's all from chapter 1.
All right. Just going to follow those verses in the parentheses there. Verse 2, she weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Verse 9, her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Therefore, her fall is terrible. She has no comforter. O Lord, behold my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. Verse 16. For these things I weep, my eyes flow with tears, for a comforter is far from me, one to revive my spirit. My children are desolate, for the enemy has prevailed. Zion stretches out her hands, but there is none to comfort her. The Lord has commanded against Jacob that his neighbors should be his foes. Jerusalem has become a filthy thing among them. Verse 21. They heard my groaning, yet there is no one to comfort me. All my enemies have heard of my trouble. They are glad that you have done it. You have brought the day you announced. Now let them be as I am.
So he keeps saying over and over again how there's no one to comfort, or the comforter is far away. But yet at the same time, the whole book it's an appeal to God for comfort, which we see there in chapter 2 and chapter 5.
Okay, 19 through 22 of chapter 2. Arise, cry out in the night, at the beginning of the night watches. Pour out your heart like water before the presence of the Lord. Lift your hands to him for the lives of your children who faint for hunger at the head of every street. Look, O Lord, and see with whom you have dealt thus. Should women eat the fruit of their womb, the children of their tender care? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? In the dust of the streets lie the young and the old, my young woman and my young men, my young women and my young men have fallen by the sword. You have killed them in the day of your anger, slaughtering them without pity. You summoned as if to a festival day my terrors on every side. And on the day of the anger of the Lord, no one escaped or survived. Those whom I held and raised, my enemy destroyed. Then chapter 5, verse 1. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see us and see our disgrace.
Says in chapter 1, he said all those things and how there's no one to comfort them. But then he's describing everything that's going on, and he's saying that to God, and he's looking to God for comfort. And another paradox is how he pleaded to God for restoration. That's 5:21. It says, restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old. And then at the same time, he fears that God will never do that. So right there in that same section there, it says, why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so many days? And then he says, restore us. And then also he says, unless you have utterly rejected us and you remain exceedingly angry with us. And that's how the book ends. So that right there is a very good example of how, between 2021 and 22, he's going back and forth between, pleading to God for restoration, but then he's also afraid that God is never going to do that. And the author in our textbook says how, these are the mixed emotions that are so characteristics of suffering people, that, they're going back and forth and, and feeling these different emotions of how, God's not going to hear my prayer, but then I also feel confident that God is there and he did hear. There's no one to bring comfort, but I'm still going to continue to appeal to God for comfort, and God's going to restore us, but he's afraid that that will never happen. And like we said before, the author is fully aware that it's God who's in charge, and he's the one who brought this destruction. But yet at the same time, as they're going through the suffering, and we can see these raw emotions that you feel a bunch of mixed emotions. And it's comforting to know that this is in scripture, and when we feel that, when we go through things, that it's okay to feel that we're not doing something that's that's sinful, but this is completely normal for humans to feel.
Kind of like in Revelation 6, in that fifth seal, where those that were martyred cried out, how long, O Lord?
All right, so that is our second theme in Lamentations, on how the author of Lamentations was brutally honest with God about the emotional and spiritual pain, and how we see that just in the structure of how he uses the Hebrew alphabet to show that. And also we saw that just in, just how honest he was in terms of the actual, the text of the book, and how he, he's blaming everything on God, but at the same time, he's also expressing confidence that God can hear, and he can bring comfort, and he can restore. And just this bag of mixed emotions is, it's just characteristics of those who are suffering. All right, and our final theme in the book of Lamentations is that the author of Lamentations, he stressed God's faithfulness as the basis for hope in suffering. So God is righteous and he will punish sin, just as he said he would, but he's also faithful to his covenant promises and his covenant people, and he will forgive sin, just as he said he would. So we're going to see some stuff from outside of Lamentations here. Probably skip Deuteronomy, but read Leviticus and Hosea.
Okay. 26, 40 to 45. Okay. But if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers in their treachery that they committed against me, and also in walking contrary to me, so that I walked contrary to them and brought them into the land of their enemies, if then their uncircumcised heart is humbled and they make amends for their iniquity, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and I will remember my covenant with Isaac and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. But the land shall be abandoned by them and enjoy its Sabbaths while it lies desolate without them. And they shall make, amends for their iniquity because they spurned my rules and their soul abhorred my statutes. Yet for all that, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not spurn them, neither will I abhor them so as to destroy them utterly and break my covenant with them, for I am the Lord their God. But I will, for their sake, remember the covenant with their forefathers, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations, that I might be their God. I am the Lord.
So this is the same chapter that we read for the punishment of how, it was God who was the one who was causing this disobedience. And how God initially, he lays out these blessings for following the covenant, and then he lays out the curses for if they disobey the covenant. And he also has this thing at the end where, if they do repent, he will forgive them, and he will remember the covenant and his people. And also he promises that even when they're in this other land, that he's not going to utterly destroy them.
So Hosea chapter 2, 19 through 23. And I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. And in that day I will answer, declares the Lord. I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth, and the earth shall answer the grain, the wine, and the oil, and they shall answer Jezreel. And I will sow her for myself in the land, and I will have mercy on no mercy. And I will say to not my people, you are my people. And he shall say, you are my God.
So this is God not giving up on his people, and how this is the hope that they have even in the midst of suffering. They have this confident assurance that he will meet the repentant with real mercy in accordance with his character and promise. And we see this even back in God's covenant with Abraham, that it's God who walked in the middle, saying that he's going to be faithful to the covenant no matter what the Abraham and his descendants do, that he's still going to keep his promises. So that is the hope that they have, even in the midst of punishment. And this is pretty much the worst thing that could happen to them. But even amongst that, they still have hope. And, all right, so now we're back in our in Lamentations. So after the author despaired that hope was lost, which is seen in
3:18. So I say, my endurance has perished. So is my hope from the Lord.
And then he reflects on it further, and it helps him recognize that hope still exists because of the character of God. So we see that in the same chapter, a few verses down.
21 to 23. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And then in 31 to 33,
Mhm.
for the Lord will not cast off forever, but though he cause grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not afflict from his heart or grieve the children of men.
And, we can also go to Exodus.
34. Okay. Exodus 34, 6 and 7. The Lord passed before him, that is, before Moses, and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on their children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation.
So the author, he felt that all hope was lost, but then upon further reflection, he understands that, there's still hope. And it's not because of, there's going to be some turn of world affairs, but there's hope because of the character of God and how God has promised that, he's going to be faithful to his people, and he's going to be faithful. That's the hope that they have. And I guess the stipulation here is that, God's going to be faithful to his people, and it doesn't apply to, those who are not his people. So, like the nations around them, eventually, like Babylon and Assyria and everyone, they got destroyed, and they're pretty much wiped out of world history. And it's only the people of God that, he was faithful to, and there's still a remnant of them, which under the new covenant is the church. So the appropriate response from the people of God to discipline and suffering is trust and patience.
Okay, chapter 3, verses 24 to 26. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord.
Mhm. So you can see here how all of this is happening, right there in chapter 3, how first in 18, he loses hope, and then he realizes that, he does have hope, and how the love of God, it never ceases. His mercies are new every morning. And, right after that, his resolution, and how, those we should continue to seek God, and we should wait quietly for the salvation of God. So we're trusting and we're waiting in patience, and that should be our proper response. And so with that, this we see how the author of Lamentations, even with all of the raw emotions that that's being said in the book, how some of this is kind of difficult to read. He's still, right in the middle of the book, like we talked about how chapter 3 is the most personal chapter, and how it's right in the middle of the book. It's kind of the highest point of the book. And in there, he's stressing God's faithfulness as the basis for hope and suffering. So that is the third key theme. And so moving on here to the conclusion. So in our textbook here, the author kind of does not really mention Lamentations in the conclusion. The conclusion is basically looking ahead, which makes sense in terms of what we just saw in the last theme there, how hope and suffering. So at the end of the narrative of Kings, hope in Yahweh's salvation is hinted. So at the end of the narrative, like we talked about, their Jerusalem is gone, the temple is gone, all of God's people are in exile, but even in that narrative there, in Second Kings at the end there, there is this hope is hinted as God's promises still stand, and how he will preserve a royal remnant.
Oh, sorry. Falling down on the job.
25, 25 to 30.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Verses 25 to 30. But in the 7th month, Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, son of Elishama of the royal family, came with 10 men and struck down Gedaliah and put him to death, along with the Jews and the Chaldeans who were with him at Mizpah. Then all the people, both small and great, and the captains of the forces arose and went to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans. And in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison. And he spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put off his prison garments, and every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king, according to his daily needs, as long as he lived.
Mhm. And that is the end of Second Kings, which is where the narrative of the first half of the Old Testament stops. And in just those 6 verses, it's interesting how it turns, where Nebuchadnezzar, he captures the land, and he takes all the people that the people who are he thinks that could help him in his kingdom. He takes them all into exile, and then he leaves a few people behind, and he appoints that guy Gedaliah there as the governor. But then this Ishmael, he comes in, he kills them, and they're afraid, and they run off to Egypt. So even the people who were kind of the remnant, they are also they're afraid of the Babylonian king, and they're running away from the land. But then the narrative just takes this crazy turn there, and it says how the rightful king of Israel, who's in exile, and how he was restored. He was freed from prison, and the Babylonian king lets him sit at the king's table. And that isn't much, but it kind of hints at what's coming. So how that relates to Lamentations is that that's where we left off the narrative, and then we've been kind of going through the commentary on the narrative, and then Lamentations at the end of the commentary, it is also kind of echoing the hope. Like we just saw how God's faithfulness in the midst of suffering is their hope, and that's hope is echoed through the books since, including Lamentations, and that's going to be kind of what's going to happen in the books that are coming up. So this confidence in God's mercy and faithfulness, it provides the context for reading Daniel through Chronicles. As the narrative picks back up in Daniel through Chronicles, the focus is future oriented. It's filled with anticipation of complete restoration, the destruction of all of God's enemies, and the global establishment of the divine kingdom through the Messiah. So, the Lamentations is kind of serves this important purpose here, that, even among their worst suffering, they still have hope because of God's character, His mercy and faithfulness. And we read the rest of the narrative in that context, and it helps us kind of understand those books better, and how all of this is going to be fulfilled in the Messiah. So that's how our kind of textbook links to Lamentations, which is kind of typically a very forgotten book, and but it's important. It plays a crucial role here in linking us in kind of the whole story of the Old Testament, and how everything's looking forward to Jesus. And so that's pretty much all we have. So any questions? If not, Pam, can you close us in prayer?
Sure. Father, I thank you for your word. And I thank you for the book of Lamentations and for the similarities that that we see between the Jewish people and of the nation of Judah to the nation of the United States today. Not saying that that we are God's people as the United States, but just seeing that we have we've sinned, we've watched those that have gone before us, and we've continued on the same sinful paths instead of learning, and we are suffering judgment as we see in our world today. And Father, I do thank you that you are there for us to turn to you, to express our emotions about all this, and that when it comes right down to it, we can trust you, and we have hope, great hope, because of the Lord Jesus Christ and his sacrifice for us, and that we have the hope of heaven to look forward to, and that it will be a place of great blessings, and the tribulations that we go through now, they'll be gone. And Father, I do thank you for Deepak and his work in putting this together tonight.
Yes.
And pray that you would bless him and his family, and continue to use him in teaching your word. Amen.
Amen.